What's up, world history? Welcome back. I hope everybody's doing well, being nice to your siblings. Don't drive your parents crazy. We are on day 2 of week 5 of online learning, and we're talking about resistance movements. Yesterday, we talked about anti apartheid resistance, and that was in South Africa. If you recall, that was protests against the policy of discrimination, specifically racial segregation of the minority of residents of South Africa, being the white South Africans, um, marginalizing the black South Africans. So we talked about resistance against that, most notably through the story of Nelson Mandela, who was jailed for being anti-apartheid and was in jail for many years before eventually getting out, winning the Nobel Peace Prize, and becoming the president of South Africa. So Nelson Mandela's triumph over apartheid, not single-handedly, but the triumph over apartheid was certainly a situation where resistance created great change. And there are other situations, unfortunately, where resistance is met with force that overpowers it, and that resistance doesn't achieve its ultimate goals. Now, it could have some success in terms of changing the global narrative, things like that, but some resistance movements, they don't achieve their goals. And this is unfortunately one of them. We're talking about the Tiananmen Square protests, the massacre, if you will. The protesters based in Tiananmen Square in central Beijing were peacefully calling for political and economic reform. In response, the Chinese authorities responded with overwhelming force to repress the demonstrations. Military units were brought in, and unarmed protesters and onlookers were killed en masse. That just means in large groups. The Chinese government has never acknowledged the true events surrounding the Tiananmen massacre. It remains a contentious topic in China, with authorities banning all mention of the protest even today. Contentious just means hotly debated, but even today, and this information came from the Amnesty International site. It's recent information. You still can't mention it. You can't mention the protests. The United States, people, sometimes criticize our government of censorship, but communist China, they really take it to a whole another level, as do other communist nations. But I guess that's really neither here nor there. So, what led up to the protests? Well, from April 1989, people from across China gathered in Beijing's Tiananmen Square to mourn the death of Liberal Communist Party leader Hu Yaobang and share their frustrations about the slow pace of promised reform. The gathering turned into peaceful protests, which spread across the provinces of China as demonstrators, mainly students, began to call for an end to official corruption and for political and economic reform. That is one of your fill in the blanks on your lesson analysis assignment today. Um, I said the gathering into peaceful protest, which spread across the provinces of China as demonstrators, blank, mainly students. Guys, these are mostly college students, but still, students nonetheless, young people. On May 13th, hundreds of student protesters in Tiananmen Square went on hunger strike in order to speak for, in order to speak a push a speech for talks with Communist Party leaders. It's estimated that 1 million people joined the protest in Beijing to express their support for the students on hunger strike and to demand reform. Eventually, the government declares martial law. So they send in the troops to enforce the law. Party leaders visited the student protest on 19th of May. The protesters ended their hunger strike that evening. However, the next day, martial law was declared in Beijing to, quote, firmly stop the unrest. In the weeks that followed the declaration of martial law, hundreds of thousands of people once again protested on the streets of Beijing, with similar demonstrations taking place in cities across China. This up top is a quote, an official Chinese quote. They deliver the news to their citizens through an agency, basically a propaganda network. The troops are by no means targeted at the students. Under no circumstances will the troops harm innocent people, let alone young students. That was not the truth, but that was the official statement. Overnight, June 3rd to 4th, the government sent tens of thousands of armed troops and hundreds of armored military vehicles into the city center to enforce martial law and forcibly clear the streets of demonstrators. The government wanted to restore order, as they put it, in the capital. As they approached the demonstrations, troops opened fire on crowds of protesters and onlookers. They gave no warning before they started shooting. This is a journalist from a publication called The Guardian, a man named John Giddens. The first casualty in the square was rushed away. A girl with her face smashed and bloody carried spread eagle towards the trees. Another followed, a youth with a bloody mess around his chest. As the troops kept firing into the crowds, some of those running away were shot in the back. Others were crushed to death by military vehicles. No one knows the death toll from Tiananmen that night because, of course, the Chinese officials are obviously they're not going to release death totals. That would look very, very bad, to say the least. And that's just not the way that information is shared in a communist country. We took the wounded on stretchers and went down Tiananmen Square. As we went down the side of the square, we saw soldiers with large plastic bags. They were putting people in the bags. I could not tell how many people. There were also people surrounded by soldiers, being kicked by them. I could hear shouts and the odd gunshot. I thought there were around 200 young people. In early June, I heard from public security sources that they had all been executed on June 9th in a rural district near Beijing. They included some students and residents of Beijing. Tank Man. I have dubbed him a resistance icon because he is featured in one of the most iconic photographs in modern history. At least, certainly, when you're talking world politics and the history of unrest and resistance. Someone who goes by Tank Man. And the reason he goes by Tank Man, well, you'll see the reason, but um, it's this guy right here. They call him Tank Man because nobody knows who he is. They've never been able to um, identify him. But this is him in Beijing, standing there. It looks like he's wearing his work clothes, possibly a student. He's got a bag in his left hand. And this is just used as a symbol to represent the way that the government was really being brutal towards their own people. And it emphasized the fact that he's just standing there with his shirt tucked in at what looks like a crosswalk. That sort of emphasizes the idea that these protesters were regular people. The Tiananmen protests were immortalized in Western media on June 5th through the image of the lone man in a white shirt carrying shopping bags, facing an imposing column of military tanks sent by the government to disperse protesters. The man is simply known as Tank Man. His identity has never been confirmed, and I want us to look at something that is very interesting.
I was with a small group of people on a balcony looking down from 5 floors up. When I took that picture, what was going through my mind was that I was miles away, too far away, and I wish I were closer, I wish I were down on the street. It's really quite a graphic photograph. You've got the linings, the marks on the road, the guy with his white shirt. There's a sort of monochrome feel to it.
I do think that this picture rates between the top three of iconic picture in the history of photography. It's a great picture because it covers a remarkable event and it's shot in a very simple, direct way. So the picture grabs your attention and holds the attention.
I was on the street at Tiananmen Square during 3rd June and 4th June. I witnessed a lot of the people standing up, block tank.
I first saw it when I was in middle school. So I was born actually in 1989. So I was seeing this in a history book, and truly and honestly, it was inspiring.
The first time I saw this picture, I was living in India. Those were days when television was still not very active, so we were really reliant on print images. Because just the power of one individual facing off these tanks is just unforgettable.
This image just shows people how can fight your rights.
This is man against the machine, the individual against the system. It's also David against Goliath, the small guy against the regime that wants to oppress him.
That photograph is and demonstrates for me one man's extraordinary courage, standing up in front of a row of tanks, being prepared to sacrifice his own life for the sake of social justice.
What I really love in this picture is the fact that I don't think that this tank man is acting for himself, but it's really acting on behalf of human beings and humanity, on behalf also of the thousands of people who struggled for human rights in China.
You don't need to meet violence with violence. You have power in nonviolence. For me, it's an extremely inspiring photo because that's what it symbolizes.
This was driven by television. It was shown, flashed all over the world. People saw that and saw this sort of extraordinary footage of this man literally dancing in front of a tank, holding it back, stopping it. And that's what became, in a sense, iconic. The photograph that I was lucky enough to take was kind of a souvenir, was a memory for people of the television footage.
I think it's been a huge source of inspiration for people across the world because fundamentally...
And I'm going to try to find us some coverage of that because we're at a point now in history where modern enough to where you can find really good videos sometimes, photos and videos. So let's see, Tiananmen resistance, old, not old man, old news clip. Although I spelled Tiananmen wrong. Oh, terrific. This is apparently from the BBC. I love that we can do this. I think it's so cool that I get to share my screen with you.
Hey, I just read an unbelievable article in the Epic Times. Take a look.
Nobody cares.
It's an investigation into the mysterious origins of the current.
The noise of gunfire rose from all over the center of Peking. It was unremitting. On the streets leading down to the main road to Tiananmen Square, furious people stared in disbelief at the glow in the sky, listening to the sound of shots. Heading down the road was a hazardous business, but hundreds of people cheered as buses were set alight and army trucks caught fire too. They yelled and shouted, and then as troop lorries were seen moving down the road, there was gunfire from those lorries. The troops have been firing indiscriminately, but still, there are thousands of people on the streets who will not move back. The bicycle rickshaws scooped up the injured. Others were shunted onto bikes and pedaled to hospital. Many were carried away by frantic local residents. There was confusion and despair among those who could hardly credit that their own army was firing wildly at them. Many were bystanders, perhaps naive about the savagery of the situation. Indeed, it was hard at times to grasp that this army was launching into an unarmed civilian population as if charging into battle. From Tiananmen Square, the sound of gunfire sounded like a battle, but it was one-sided. A line of soldiers was strung out, facing a huge crowd. The air was filled with shouts of "Fascists! Stop killing!" We were in the line facing the troops. They were about 250 yards away. Young people were singing the Internationale to a background of gunfire. After hours of shooting and facing a line of troops, the crowd is still here. They're shouting, "Stop the killing and down with the government." A huge volley of shots just as I left the front line caused panic. The young man in front of me fell dead. I fell over him. 2 others were killed yards away. 2 more people lay wounded on the ground near me.
Wow, that's amazing video. If we get finished with the PowerPoint, we're going to come back to that. Where were we? Tank Man wouldn't let military vehicles past, and eventually he was pulled out of the way by onlookers. But the image of the unarmed man versus a tank quickly came to symbolize the struggle of the Tiananmen protesters. A peaceful protest met with military might. There was a huge crackdown after that. Immediately after the military crackdown, the Chinese authorities began to hunt down those involved in the demonstrations. Thousands of people were detained, tortured, imprisoned, or executed after unfair trials charged with counter-revolutionary crimes. The Chinese authorities have never disclosed the total number of people detained, tried, or executed throughout China since the June 1989 crackdown. In the climate of terror which followed the massacre, the relatives of those killed were not only unable to seek justice for their loss, They were even unable to mourn openly the dead, who were officially described as rioters. Tiananmen and the 1989 crackdown remains an official taboo topic in China. There is no official death toll. Attempts to discuss, commemorate, and demand justice for what happened have been forcefully curbed, with no public discussion allowed. Since 1989, many people have been imprisoned for commemorating events or questioning the official line. Only recently, a court in Changshu in an eastern city found a man named Guy Yemen guilty of inciting state subversion after he tried to post images of post Tiananmen Beijing online. He wanted to stage a protest. He was convicted. So, you guys do have an analysis assignment about this lesson. Hopefully, you found it interesting. I just love that we got to see it play out live, and I will talk to you guys tomorrow. We're on the home stretch, so keep on doing your work, get everything turned in. You can do it. We're almost at the finish line. All right. On our way out, you can log out if you want to, but I'm going to play the final minute of this.
Ambulances screamed up to the troop line and were turned away. They couldn't get to the square. 2 ambulance drivers were shot and injured. Earlier, we'd been driving at the back of the Forbidden City, the old part of Peking, near the square. We picked up a woman with a bullet in the head and took her to the nearby children's hospital, into a scene of near mayhem. Casualties were arriving every few seconds. On bikes, rickshaws, park benches, carried in, all with gunshot wounds. Housewives, elderly residents, people shot while sitting in their homes. The operating theatre was overflowing, many of the staff in tears. In 20 minutes, 40 seriously injured were brought for emergency surgery. 2 were already dead. In the streets, many came up to us, shaking with anger and disbelief and fear. Many were terrified, saying there would be retribution. There was not one voice on the streets which did not express despair and rage. Tell the world, they said to us.
Wow. It's powerful stuff. Okay, guys, I will talk to you tomorrow.